There's something unsettling about houses that refuse to let go of the past. Every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of a light, every draft that slips under a closed door. It all feels different when you're inside a house with history. A house that has seen tragedy. A house where people lived, suffered, and sometimes never really left. Across the country, there are countless stories of so-called haunted houses. Some are old farmhouses where widows grieved until their last breath. Some are Victorian homes where families vanished, leaving everything behind. Others are plain, ordinary houses that look no different than your neighbors until night falls and the silence comes alive. People who've experienced these encounters often describe the same things. Footsteps in empty halls, doors opening on their own, strange whispers in the dark, and shadows that watch but never blink. Skeptics will call it imagination, but those who've lived it, those who've stood in those rooms at night, swear the experiences are real. Tonight, I'll share with you 3 terrifying true encounters inside haunted houses. Stories told not as legends or campfire tales, but as first-hand experiences by the people who lived them and never forgot. So turn down the lights. Make sure your doors are locked, because what you're about to hear may change the way you look at your own home. When my wife Elena and I first moved to Cleveland, we weren't looking for anything special. We were just newly married, trying to start a life together, and like most young couples, we were broke. Our budget was tight, and every house we looked at was either too small, too expensive, or in a neighborhood we couldn't imagine raising a family in. Then one day, while driving through an older part of town, we came across a large Victorian house sitting on the corner of a quiet street. It was massive, 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch, big bay windows, and ivy climbing up the side. But what stood out the most was how abandoned it looked. The yard was overgrown. The shutters hung crooked. The paint was peeling. But when we saw the for sale sign out front, curiosity got the better of us. The real estate agent met us there later that week. She seemed nervous, almost like she didn't want to be inside. I remember how quickly she rushed us through each room, barely giving us time to take in the details. The strange thing was that the house still had furniture inside. Old couches, dining tables, beds, even dishes in the cabinets. Why did the previous owners leave everything behind? I asked. The agent avoided my eyes and muttered something about financial issues before quickly changing the subject. Despite how strange it was, Elena and I were thrilled. The place was far larger than we expected we could ever afford, and it was being sold for a price so low it felt like a steal. We signed the papers within a week. At first, moving in felt like an adventure. We spent our evenings dusting, cleaning, unpacking boxes. But almost right away, Elena told me she felt uncomfortable. She said the house didn't feel empty, even when it was just the 2 of us inside. I laughed it off, said old houses always creak and groan. But then I noticed it too. The first night I really heard it, I was lying awake in bed. It was late, maybe past midnight, and the house was completely still. That's when I heard it, soft, slow, steady. Breathing. It wasn't Elena. She was asleep beside me, breathing quietly. This was different. It seemed to come from the walls, as if the entire house itself was inhaling and exhaling. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound was unmistakable. The next morning, Elena asked me if I'd heard it too. When I admitted I had, she looked terrified. Over the next few nights, it got worse. Sometimes the air in the room would feel like it shifted in time with the sound, as though the house was expanding and contracting. Sometimes, we swore we could feel a faint breeze on our skin when there were no windows open. One night, while unpacking boxes in the basement, Elena froze in the middle of the room. Her eyes went wide, and she bolted upstairs. When I finally calmed her down enough to speak, she told me that a voice had whispered directly into her ear. "Why are you here?" From that moment, everything escalated. We'd hear footsteps pacing back and forth in the upstairs hallway, even though no one was there. Doors would slam shut behind us, sometimes hard enough to rattle the frames. Lights flickered constantly, even bulbs we had just replaced. And worst of all, At random hours of the night, the breathing would return, louder and heavier than before. The night that finally drove us out came about 3 weeks after moving in. I remember the exact time because I woke suddenly, my eyes snapping open at 3:11 a.m. The room was freezing cold, and at first I thought maybe it was just another strange draft from the old windows. But then I heard it, breathing. Deep, labored, ragged breathing, like something huge was standing in the room with us. I turned my head toward the bedroom door, and that's when I saw it. A tall, dark figure stood in the doorway. I couldn't make out details, but I could see the outline of its chest rising and falling with each massive inhale. With every exhale, the sound seemed to fill the entire room. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe myself. My body felt frozen to the mattress. The figure began to lean forward, as though it was watching me, studying me. The air felt thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. Then suddenly the entire house seemed to shift. The walls groaned. The floorboards trembled. And then the house exhaled. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force. The breath rushed through the rooms, rattling the windows, pushing against us like a wave of air. The figure dissolved into darkness, but the sound of that final exhale echoed through the house long after it vanished. By sunrise, Elena and I had packed our essentials and left. We didn't even bother grabbing most of our belongings. We just wanted out. We never went back. The house is still there today, abandoned. The neighbors told us that nobody stays there long. Some say they've walked past late at night and heard it, the sound of that house breathing in the dark. I never thought I'd inherit anything in my life, least of all a house. But in the summer of 1983, after my aunt passed away, I became the unexpected owner of a small farmhouse on the edge of rural Alabama. The house wasn't big or fancy. It sat on a patch of land surrounded by tall pines and a long dirt road that hardly anyone drove down anymore. People in town called it the widow's place. I grew up hearing that name whispered in the corner booths of diners or murmured in the barber shop, usually followed by stories meant to scare kids. My aunt, Margaret, had lived there since before I was born. She wasn't always called the widow. People said she used to be lively, full of laughter, always baking pies for the church and inviting neighbors over. But everything changed the year her husband, Henry, died. He was crushed under a tractor on the property. Neighbors heard the scream and ran over too late to save him. After that, she wasn't the same. She wore black every day, stopped coming into town, stopped answering her phone. People said she shut herself inside that upstairs bedroom and hardly came out. For nearly 20 years, she lived like that, alone in that room until the day someone finally found her body in the bed. So when I inherited the place, you can imagine the kind of reputation it already had. But I wasn't a superstitious man. To me, it was just a house. Free land. Maybe a chance to fix it up, flip it, and pocket some cash. I moved in late August. The air was thick with humidity, and the house smelled of old wood and dust. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and the floor groaned with every step. But I wasn't afraid, at least not at first. The first thing I noticed was how heavy the silence felt inside. It wasn't like normal quiet. It pressed down on you. Outside, you'd hear cicadas, crickets, maybe a car passing in the distance. But inside, it was as though the house swallowed sound whole. I set up in the downstairs guest room for the first week, figuring I'd clean as I went. My aunt's bedroom upstairs still had her old furniture, an iron bed frame, a vanity with a cracked mirror, a wardrobe that smelled faintly of mothballs. I had no intention of sleeping there. I just kept the door shut and told myself I'd deal with it later. But that was the problem. No matter how many times I closed that door, it would never stay shut. The first night, I noticed it hanging open a few inches when I went up for tools. I figured maybe the latch was loose. The second night, I heard it creak open while I was downstairs. I went up, shut it firmly, even jiggled the knob to make sure it caught. Not an hour later, I walked by again, and there it was open. By the third night, it had become routine. I'd close it, latch it, and at some point it would creak open on its own. Always slow, never sudden, as though someone was easing it open just enough to watch. I tried everything. I jammed a chair under the knob. I wedged a screwdriver in the frame. And yet, every single time, I'd wake to find it open again. It was around then that the dreams started. I'd wake up sweating in the middle of the night, sure I'd heard footsteps pacing the upstairs hall. Sometimes, I swore I heard the sound of fabric rustling, like someone shifting in a long dress. One night, I dreamed of a woman crying softly, her voice low and broken, echoing through the walls. I woke up, and the sound didn't stop immediately. It lingered, fading only as I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Still, I told myself it was just the house getting to me. Old wood, old pipes, my imagination. Until the storm. It was late September, maybe a month after I'd moved in. The rain started in the evening, and built into a full thunderstorm by midnight. The wind howled against the shutters, and the walls seemed to shudder with every crack of thunder. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. That upstairs door opening. I sat up slowly, straining my ears. The storm outside roared, but underneath it, I could hear the steady groan of the hinges. I told myself not to go look, that it was better not to know, but my curiosity got the better of me. I opened my own bedroom door and looked across the hall. My aunt's door was wide open, and standing in the doorway was a figure. She was tall and thin, dressed in a long black gown that looked decades out of place. Her skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tightly over her cheekbones. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes were hollow, rimmed in shadows that seemed deeper than her face. She stared at me without blinking. My legs felt glued to the floor. When she finally spoke, her lips trembled, but her voice was strong, echoing as though it came from the walls themselves. "Leave my house." The words rattled the picture frames on the walls. My chest tightened, and every instinct screamed at me to run. I bolted down the stairs, not daring to look back. The storm howled around me, rain blowing through gaps in the old window frames, but I didn't care. I grabbed my truck keys and drove off without even locking the door. That night, I slept in my friend's spare room 20 miles away. The next morning, when I returned for a few things, the house was quiet. The door to my aunt's room stood wide open, the chair I had wedged under the knob lying halfway across the floor, as though it had been shoved. I didn't stay long. Within a week, I had made arrangements to move out permanently. I never stepped foot in that house again. Over the years, I've heard stories from others who tried to live there. Nobody stays more than a few weeks. They all say the same thing. The door upstairs won't stay shut, and if you're there long enough, the widow makes herself known. And if she doesn't want you there, you'll hear her voice the same way I did. "Leave my house." When I first left home for college, I didn't have much money. My parents helped where they could, but most of the responsibility for paying rent, tuition, and food fell on me. That meant I couldn't afford the fancy dorms or the modern apartments near campus. Instead, I found myself renting a room in an old boarding house just a few blocks from the university. It was one of those big 3-story homes that had been chopped up into separate rooms years ago. The landlord, Mr. Jacobs, was an older man who owned several properties in the area. He told me right away, in his thick, raspy voice, "Now, don't go spooking yourself if you hear odd noises. These old places, they settle. Pipes bang, wood creaks. You'll hear footsteps now and again, but it's just the house. Been like that forever." I thought nothing of it. I'd grown up around old houses. My grandparents lived in one that made all sorts of noises at night. So I signed the lease, grateful for the low rent, and moved in. The house had character. The ceilings were high, the wood floors scuffed but polished. A narrow staircase ran up the center, and each floor had 4 rented rooms. My room was on the 2nd floor, facing the street. It wasn't much, just a bed, a desk, and a wardrobe, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. The first week passed uneventfully. I studied late into the night, sometimes staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning. That's when I first noticed the footsteps. At first, I assumed it was another tenant. Light footsteps, moving up and down the hallway outside my door. They were soft, almost barefoot. But when I asked the others about it the next morning, they all denied being up so late. The next few nights, the footsteps returned. Always around the same time, after 2 a.m. They would start at one end of the hall, shuffle past my door, and fade toward the staircase. Sometimes they would pause right outside my door, as though someone was standing there listening. I began to get nervous. One night, I left my desk lamp on and sat by the door waiting. Sure enough, just after 2:30, I heard it, the soft slap of bare feet on wood. My heart raced as the steps grew closer. Through the narrow gap under the door, I saw a shadow pass by. I opened the door immediately, but the hallway was empty. Completely empty. That's when I started noticing the cold spots. Sometimes, as I stepped out into the hall, the air would suddenly drop in temperature, my breath fogging slightly in the dim light. And then I saw him. It was late on a Thursday, close to midterms. I was hunched over my desk, drowning in notes, when movement caught my eye. Something passed my open door. I looked up, and for just a moment, I saw the figure of a young boy. He couldn't have been older than 10. He wore faded pajamas, the kind with buttons down the front. His head was bent, his arms hanging limply at his sides, and he shuffled slowly past my room without looking in. I shot to my feet and ran into the hallway. But there was nothing. I stood there in silence, heart pounding, until I convinced myself I was overtired. Stress, lack of sleep, caffeine, it had to be. But it happened again. The following night, I purposely left my door cracked open. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps started. I leaned forward in my chair, every muscle tight. The boy appeared again, moving down the hall. But this time, he stopped right in front of my door. Through the gap, I saw him clearly. His skin was pale, almost bluish in the dim light, and his head hung low. Slowly, unnaturally slowly, he lifted his face toward me. That's when I saw his eyes. They were black. Not just dark, completely black, like two pits where eyes should have been. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then, in a voice that was more of a hiss than a whisper, I heard it. "Help me." I slammed the door shut, heart hammering in my chest. I stayed awake until morning, afraid to even blink. The next day, I confronted Mr. Jacobs, the landlord. I told him exactly what I'd seen. He looked at me for a long moment before sighing. "You're not the first," he muttered. "Back in the 50s, a family lived here. The father wasn't right in the head. Locked his own boy in the basement for days at a time. Kid didn't make it." I felt my stomach turn. "You mean he?" Mr. Jacobs nodded. "Died down there. Some say he still wanders the house, looking for someone to help him." That night, I couldn't bring myself to stay. I packed my essentials and slept on a friend's couch. Within a week, I moved out for good. To this day, I avoid that street. Sometimes, though, I hear from students who rented there after me. They all tell the same story. Footsteps in the hall late at night, the sound of a boy shuffling past, and a voice whispering through the cracks of the door. "Help me." Haunted houses don't always look like the places you see in movies. They don't need cobwebs, broken windows, or ghostly figures floating through the air. Sometimes the scariest ones look perfectly normal from the outside. A quiet farmhouse, an old Victorian, or a simple rental near campus. They stand there silently, blending into the neighborhood, hiding the weight of what's inside. But those who step through the doors know the truth. They've felt the cold spots that no heater can chase away. They've heard the whispers when no one is home. They've seen the shadows standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. And the question is, why do some spirits never leave? Is it grief? Anger? A tragedy too heavy to move on from? Or is it something darker, something that ties itself to the walls and refuses to let go? One thing is certain, every house has a history. And sometimes, that history lingers long after the people are gone. So the next time you hear a floorboard creak at night, or a door slowly open on its own, ask yourself this. Is it just the house settling? Or is it someone who never left? If you like true horror stories, please like, share and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next stories. Until then, stay safe and don't stay at haunted house alone. Good night.